Samuel Jones Tilden, the fourth of 7 children of Elam Tilden and Polly Younglove Jones, was born at New Lebanon, in the county of Columbia and state of New York, on the 9th day of February, 1814, when his father was in the 33rd year of his age and his mother in her 32nd. Samuel's grandfather, John Tilden, moved with his family and several of his neighbors in 1790 from the village of Lebanon in the state of Connecticut and christened the place they chose for their future home New Lebanon in honor of the one they had abandoned. Here Elam Tilden grew to man's estate, became the proprietor of a handsome farm, to the tillage of which he added the management of a fairly prosperous commercial business. New Lebanon soon became what it still is: a quiet, cheerful rural village and the center of a sober, earnest, and thoughtful population, mostly immigrants, or the immediate descendants of emigrants from Connecticut, who had borne an honorable part in the War of the Revolution, in which they each had acquired a dignifying sense of their individual importance in shaping the destinies of a nation. The village today consists practically of one long and broad street, both sides lined with the houses which constitute the homes of most of the inhabitants. At the head of the Lebanon Valley are the famous sulfur springs which half a century ago were the favorite summer resort of the nation, but which of late years have been frequented chiefly by invalids. Distant only a few minutes' ride from these springs, still flourishes a branch of the Society of Friends, called Shakers. It was organized in 1779 and was the first society of that denomination planted in the United States. The homestead of which Mr. Tilden was born, and which is still the property of the family, is a spacious frame building lying a little back from the street, shaded by majestic forest trees and well-affected shrubbery, and bearing the most unequivocal testimony to the relative worldly prosperity and social importance of its occupants. Samuel's father, Mr. Elam Tilden, was a thoughtful man, the oracle of the village on most questions of public concern, a great admirer of President Jackson's successor President Martin Van Buren, who frequented his house and prized his political sagacity and judgment. A more or less confidential correspondence with Senator Wright, which still survives, shows what value was attached to his political judgment in Washington, while his contributions to the Columbia Sentinel, a weekly paper published in a town adjoining New Lebanon, we learn that he was regarded throughout the county as a good authority upon agricultural matters. Dr. Younglove's wife Polly seems to have had a more direct and manifest influence in opening the mind and shaping the taste of Samuel during his tender years more than any other person. She was remarkable in many ways. The fearful trials of her husband as a prisoner in Canada, the terrible stories of the massacre of numerous members of her family within the memory of people then living, and the tribute of lives and blood which her family had paid in the War of Independence and in the War of 1812, had stocked her memory with wonderful experiences, all of the characters to impress and thrill a youthful imagination. She had a marvelous and expressive talent for narration. Samuel used to say that if she read a story or interesting novel, she could repeat it with such fullness of detail as to consume hours, to the delight of her youthful auditors. Polly Younglove's memorable experiences had naturally led her to take the greatest interest in political questions. In his genealogical record, Mr. Tilden relates that when the letters and papers of Thomas Jefferson were first collected in print in 1829, the same year, by the way, of her husband's death, she purchased a copy, which she covered with tea-colored muslin. This work, particularly on the last volume, was a favorite study with Polly, and she circulated it among the younger members of the family. I read them over, says Mr. Tilden, again and again, and thus became thoroughly imbued with Jeffersonian political ideas. Jefferson's political standard, more than those of any other statesman, living or dead, were Mr. Tilden's political standards throughout his life. I do not know that anywhere, in so few words, can be found a more clear, compact and comprehensive statement of the obligations of his country to Jefferson than Mr. Tilden gave in a letter which he wrote 4 years before his death, in reply to an invitation from the Jefferson Club of New Haven to be present at the commemoration of the birth of the author of our Declaration of Independence. He describes Jefferson as among the earliest, most resolute, and most steadfast of the patriots who upheld the popular rights in the incipient struggles of our revolution, when the part he took required a higher order of courage, of self-denial, and of genius than were necessary at any subsequent period of our history. He penned the immortal statement of the principles that led our ancestors to assert the independent existence of our country, and which has been substantially adopted as a model for every people who have since attempted to establish national independence on the basis of human rights. He was first in his day to completely emancipate his own mind from the monarchical and aristocratical traditions which still enslaved most of the best intellects of the country. But the obligations of the world to Mr. Jefferson do not end here. On the completion of the federal Constitution, Governor Morris, being asked what he thought of it, answered, "That depends upon how it is construed." After the organization of the federal government, a powerful class sought to impress upon it in its practical working the features of the British system. Jefferson was the great leader of the party formed to resist these efforts and to hold our institutions to the popular character which was understood to belong to them when the Constitution was ratified by the people. When elevated to the presidency, adds Mr. Tilden, he put the ship of state, to use his own expression, upon the Republican tack. He arrested centralizing tendencies, reinvigorated local self-government, restored the rights of the states, and protected and enlarged the domain of the individual judgment and conscience. For 8 years he administered the government, and for 16 years it was administered by his pupils under his observation and advice. Thus was established a habit which largely shaped the standards for the guidance of the popular judgment, the modes of thinking of statesmen, and the general course of government for 60 years. Mr. Jefferson gave to our administrative system an aspect of republican simplicity. He repressed jobbery as well as all perversions of power, and by his precepts, his influence, and his example elevated the standard of public morals. In his personal practice he was not only pure, but, to make his example more effective, he refrained, while administering the greatest of official trusts, from all attempts to increase his private fortune, even by methods open to every private citizen. Read Jefferson's writings until he knew them almost by heart. He had read Jonathan Edwards' famous Street is on the Wall before he was 15, and before he was 18 had mastered the contents of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, for a copy of which he had paid a treasured gifted gold pocket piece. Born and bred among the traditions of our war for independence, he early made himself familiar with so much of its history as had then got into print. The facility with which he absorbed knowledge, and the rapidity with which he digested it,